On the gray morning, a rich man decided the water she sold must belong to him. The wealthy estate developer, who had built his gated estate beside her settlement, stood up in the road before the whole neighborhood in the rain, pointed at a poor single mother filling her neighbor's jerrycans at her borehole, and told the gathered street that she was a thief, that the water she sold was stolen from his supply, that her pump was an illegal tap into his pipes, and that the woman who sold clean water by the bucket to feed her child had never owned a drop of what came up out of the ground beneath her feet. Adaeze Okafor did not scream, and she did not beg, and she did not run. Though his men were already swinging hammers at her tank, she knelt beside her broken pump, with a folded, water-marked drilling permit held against her chest. The permit that said she had sunk that well herself, lawfully, under license, and let them smash at her borehole, because there was nothing she could say into that ringing metal and that powerful man's certainty that the gawking street was ready to hear. And the developer who pointed at her did not know, and the muttering crowd did not know, that the water he swore was his had a record older and harder than his shouting, that the public meter on the main counted every liter, that her borehole was her own, and touched neither his estate nor that main, and that the small brass meter and the folded permit would say, plainly, at the right hour, exactly whose water had been stolen, and by whom. The street did the thing a crowd does when a big man with money names a small woman a thief. It gathered and it muttered, and the neighbors who had filled their buckets at her borehole every morning for years looked at her now as if they had never known her, because a rich man's confidence is louder than long acquaintance, and the word thief sticks to the poor the moment it is thrown. A few of the older ones, who had drunk her water through 3 dry seasons when the public taps gave nothing, frowned and held back. Most edged toward the developer's version, because it is easier to believe the poor have stolen than to believe the powerful have lied. And Adaeze felt the cold rain run down her neck and the folded permit press hard against her chest, and inside her, quiet and certain under all the noise, the one thing no hammer could drown, she knew the water was hers. She had drilled that borehole herself, paid for the license, kept the logbook, and never once touched a pipe that was not her own. She lifted her chin the way her mother had taught her over a bucket of clean water when she was small, and she said nothing aloud, because the truth she carried was stamped on a permit and counted on a meter, and a meter does not need to shout. The developer thought he was settling a thing the way he settled everything he wanted, by deciding who was small enough to be blamed, and saying it loudly from a height where no one argued. He saw a faded wrapper, a single mother with no husband to stand for her, a woman who slept in a one-room house at the edge of her borehole because she could afford nothing grander, and he had decided long before the rain that she was the one his own trouble would be hung upon. He had spent his whole comfortable life looking at people like Adaeze and seeing not what they held, but how easily it could be made to carry the weight of what he had done. Adaeze Okafor was 28 years old, and on that street she was known by everyone, and truly seen by almost no one. The water woman on the corner, the one who sold clean water by the bucket and the jerrycan from a hand pump beside a blue storage tank at the edge of the settlement. She rose each morning before the queues formed, in the small one-room house beside the borehole where she lived with her child, primed the pump with her own hands, filled the first containers as the sky grayed, and stood by that pump from first light until dark, for takings so thin a single broken part could stop them. She was, everyone who dealt with her agreed, scrupulously honest, exact with her measures, exact with her change, the kind of seller who would top up a half-empty bucket for nothing and run after you down the road to return money handed over by mistake. And she had learned long ago that being honest and being poor at the same time only meant people leaned on you and forgot you could be knocked down. Mama Water, the neighbors called her, half in fondness, and most of them did not know the half of what she carried, nor what that borehole had cost her to sink. She had not been given that well. No one hands a poor woman a borehole. She had built it herself, over years, the way the poor build anything that lasts, slowly, with sacrifice, and with more care than the comfortable ever imagine the poor are capable of. When she first came to the settlement, there was no clean water to be had. The public taps in that quarter ran dry for weeks at a time, and people walked far or bought deer from tankers, and children got sick on bad water. A Daisy had saved, and borrowed small, and gone without, until she could pay a registered borehole driller to sink a well on the leased corner she rented, and she had done the thing the poor are so often too poor or too trusting to do. She had done it properly. She had not simply paid a man to bore a hole in the night. She had applied for the permit, paid the fees, used a licensed driller who logged the depth and the water table and stamped the completion, and kept every paper folded in a flat tin against the damp: the drilling permit, the driller's logbook, the lease for the ground, the receipts. She used to think, filling buckets in the early gray, that water was the one thing a poor settlement could not live a day without, and that to give clean water honestly was a small good thing in a hard place. She kept the papers the way she kept everything, quietly, exactly, without fuss. She did not yet know how badly she would need them. The thing every lean day and every early morning at the pump was the child who slept in the one-room house beside the borehole. Daisy was alone in raising the child. The child's father had gone, and she did not spend her thin strength being bitter over a man who had chosen not to stay. She put aside a little of her takings toward the one thing she wanted in the world: to lift her child off that thin floor and into a life with a proper roof and school fees paid without fear. And the borehole and the clean water it gave was the whole of her plan for it. The small, steady thing that turned buckets into naira and naira into a future. At night, when the cues were gone and her child slept, she would sit by a small lamp with her father's old tin open on her knees and look at the permit and the logbook in her own careful hand, and feel that as long as she held them, she held something solid in a world that gave the poor very little to hold. That was what she had: a clean name, 2 working hands, a well she had sunk herself, and a flat tin of papers that said the water was truly hers to give. Here is the very thing this channel was built for, so let me say it to you plainly before we go on. If you have ever built something honestly with your own 2 hands, earned it slowly, paid for it properly, and watched a powerful person simply decide it should be theirs, and dress the taking up as if you were the thief for holding what you yourself had made, then you already belong here with us under the Baobab. Take one moment to subscribe to Baobab Tales, because the quiet, careful, overlooked people who give their neighbors clean water honestly and get called thieves the moment a rich man needs someone to blame are exactly the ones these stories are told for. And I do not want you to miss what a developer's lie was about to do to a Daisy Okafor, or what a sealed brass meter was about to do right back. To understand the woman kneeling in the rain being called a thief, you have to understand the man who pointed at her. His name was Chief Donatus Mbakwe, a wealthy estate developer in his middle 50s, who had built gated estate after gated estate across the city, and a great fortune doing it, addressed as chief by everyone who wanted anything from him. He was not, to look at him, a wicked man. He sat on committees and gave to his church and spoke beautifully about progress and modern living whenever there was a microphone before him. But under the finagbada and the easy public warmth, he was a man who had never once imagined he could be the one in the wrong, and who measured every person near his property by whether they helped his standing or threatened it. He had built his newest estate right against the edge of a Daisy settlement, a high-painted wall, a gate, generators, the promise of constant water to buyers who would pay well for it. The cruelty in that rain did not come from a criminal. It came from a respectable big man who had a problem of his own making and had decided a poor woman would carry it, which is a colder and more dangerous thing. And there was one more person who matters, though no one in that street was looking at him, because he was the kind of man people are taught to trust rather than suspect. Chief Mbakwe did not run his own estate day to day. For the gates and the pumps and the water he relied on a smooth, well-spoken caretaker named Ifeanyi Eze, a man in his 40s who held the keys to everything behind the wall, knew the estate's pipes and pumps the way a man knows his own house, and carried himself with the confidence of a man who had made many small problems disappear for the chief and been quietly well paid for it. What no one knew, because he had hidden it behind a neat uniform and an unhurried smile, was that Ifeanyi Eze had found his own private gold mine behind that wall, that he had run an illegal connection off the public water main into the estate, drawing far more water than the estate lawfully paid for, and selling the surplus by the tanker load on the side, pocketing the money himself. His greed had grown careless, the unmetered theft swelling month by month, and the day the water corporation's bulk meter began to show the estate drawing impossible quantities, his trouble, and the chief's, went looking for somewhere else to land. It found a poor water woman with a clean name and a hand pump, and her name was about to become the cover for his racket. The borehole was small, but it was real, and it was lawfully hers, and that was the whole trouble. When the bulk meter readings first came back wrong, the estate billed for water it could not possibly have used through its lawful meter alone. There was a number on a page that did not match, and a number that does not match is the start of an audit, and an audit was the one thing Chief Mbakwe could not afford, because an audit traces pipes, and a traced pipe behind his wall would lead to his caretaker and then to him. A reasonable man, an innocent man, would have let the water corporation come and find the fault. But Chief Mbakwe was not about to invite enforcement officers to crawl over his own estate, so he and his caretaker did the thing such men do. They decided to make the discrepancy somebody else's crime. If a thief could be produced, a visible, plausible, poor thief, already selling water at his very wall, then the missing water had a face that was not theirs, and the enforcement that came would come down not on his gate, but on hers. And there she was, the water woman on the corner, selling from a borehole. Easy to point at, easy to disbelieve. So the chief turned the matter outward, and told his caretaker, in the way powerful men say such things without quite saying them, to handle it and make sure the blame landed on her. And Ifeanyi, with his own theft howling at his back, handled it. The quiet, ordinary cruelty that eats the poor in that city every day. He spread the word, first quietly and then loudly, that the water woman's borehole was no borehole at all, but an illegal tap into the estate's supply. That she had run a hidden pipe and was selling the chief's own water back to the settlement. That the missing water at the meter was her theft. He had a story ready, and a few mouths paid to repeat it, and a glossy printed complaint drawn up in the chief's name. He did not imagine that the well the poor woman had sunk had been drilled lawfully under permit, logged and stamped, nor that anyone of standing would ever bother to trace a pipe on a water seller's behalf. He looked at Adeze the way the chief did, too small to matter, too poor to be heard, and built his lie to fit a woman he was sure could not answer it. And then, the complaint in hand and the story seated in the street, Chief Mbakwe did what such men do when they have decided the law is a costume they may wear at will. He did not quietly call the water corporation and wait for an inspection. He came to the borehole itself, with men and with hammers, on a gray, rainy morning, to deal with the thief, as he put it, by simply dealing with her. It is the oldest move there is in that city. The man with the money and the loud accusation arrives in force, breaks what the poor have built, and lets the wreckage and the shouting stand in for the guilt he has not proved. knowing the poor cannot unsmash a pump or unspill a tank, and that a thing once broken and a person once shamed in public are hard to put right, whatever a meter says later. The morning it happened, Adeze was out early at her pump as she always was, filling the first jerrycans in the soft rain, the queue just beginning to form. When the vehicles came, the chief's car, and behind it the men, and behind them a small truck with the estate's name on the door. Chief Mbakwe got out, dry under a held umbrella, and announced to the gathering street, in a voice pitched to carry, that this woman had been stealing water from his estate, that her so-called borehole was an illegal tap into his supply, and that he had borne it long enough and would now put a stop to it. "Look at her," he said, gesturing at Adeze, standing at her pump, "selling my water back to you and calling it her own. Stealing from the very estate that gives this area life. Enough, the theft ends today." And the awful machinery of it began, not an engine this time, but the ring of hammers, and beneath it the older machinery, the one that turns a poor woman into a thief the instant a rich man needs one. Adeze stepped toward him in the rain with her heart pounding and her tin of papers clutched to her chest, and she said, plainly and steadily, that the water was hers, that she had drilled the borehole herself under permit, that it touched no estate and no main, and that she held the license and the logbook to prove it, that whatever complaint the chief was waiving, the meter on the main would show his estate's water, not hers. And that, she would think later, was the first hard lesson of that morning, that she had the whole truth, stamped and logged and counted on a meter, and that it did not matter yet at all, because the crowd was gawking and the chief was loud, and a folded permit in the hands of a poor woman is a quieter thing than a great man's certainty and a hammer's ring. The chief did not so much as glance at the tin. "Papers," he said, throwing the word away with contempt. "Anyone can waive a paper. Where was your permit when my meter showed the water gone? You have been tapping my line. Break it." And the crowd, half believing and half afraid, took up his contempt, because a poor woman with an old tin of papers is a story a watching street can be talked out of believing. And Chief Mbakwe did not hesitate, did not pause, did not ask a single honest question. He had his answer, and his answer moved his own crime off his gate, and that was all he required of the truth. "Thief," he said, loud enough for the whole street to hear. "She has stolen from this estate for months, pretending it was her own well. I always knew these people would try it, tap a man's line and sell it back to their own neighbors." He turned and performed his outrage, telling the street how patient he had been, how much water she had stolen, how the law was on his side, and he gave the order, and his men swung their hammers, and the pump head buckled, and the blue tank split and emptied its clean water into the mud, and the pipe was wrenched and bent, and the borehole the poor woman had sunk by hand was broken before her eyes. Somewhere at the edge of the crowd, dry under his own umbrella, and careful to look like a man merely overseeing a lawful job, stood Ifeanyi Eze, watching his racket's cover get built out of a poor woman's ruin. And no one at all, was looking at him, which was exactly as he had needed it to be. Adeze tried, once more, to be heard. She opened the tin and drew out the drilling permit and the logbook, the rain spotting them, and held them up, and said the proof was right here, that anyone who knew water could see her licensed borehole, the registered driller's logged depth, the permit number, the lease for the ground, and that her well stood alone and had never touched his pipes. And for a moment the stamped papers in her hands and her plain, exact words made the nearer neighbors hesitate, because some of them had watched the driller sink that very well. But the chief moved fast over that hesitation, because a man like that knows a doubt must be crushed before it spreads. "So now, I am the thief?" he thundered. turning her words into an insult against himself. The water thief accuses the man whose line she has been bleeding. You hear her, stealing my water and pointing at her betters, and the crowd, which would rather believe a poor stranger is a liar than be made to side against a powerful man with a truck full of men, swung back to him, and the small hesitation died. And Adeze lowered the papers and went very still and very straight, which the crowd read as the silence of the guilty, and which was in truth the last dignity of a woman who has understood she is alone in the rain. So they broke her borehole while she watched. The pump smashed, the tank split, the clean water she sold soaking away into the mud, the pipe bent and useless. And the men padlocked a chain across the pump head and warned her off the corner. Against the day, the chief said, that the matter would be settled and the illegal tap removed for good. The neighbors who had filled their buckets there for years drew back. Some of the bolder ones muttered that she should have known better than to sell water at a big man's wall, that she had brought it on herself with her stubbornness. Adeze gathered her child and the flat tin and the little bundle of things they had, and she walked away from her broken pump in the rain, with her back straight and the whole street's half-belief at her back. A woman who had sunk her own well lawfully, driven off it as a thief on a rich man's word. She did not weep where they could see her. She lifted her chin, and she held the tin, and she went. This is the moment the channel was built to make you feel, so sit with it for one breath before we go on. Because if you have ever built something with your own hands that was honestly and truly yours, and watched a powerful person break it with a confident lie and a show of force, while a watching crowd decided it was easier to call you the thief than to call him one, then you already know exactly how that rain felt on Adeze's neck as she walked away from her broken pump. If you've made it this far into Adeze's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. She did not break down on the road. She found shelter with an old aunt in a poorer part of the city, and she went, with her tin of papers, to the places a poor person is told to go: a settlement association elder, a junior official at the local council, anyone who might listen, and told the same plain story, that the borehole was hers, drilled lawfully, and that the chief's accusation was a lie. And they listened the way comfortable men listen to a poor woman a big man has already branded a thief. Politely, briefly, minds half made up. The chief was the chief. He had a complaint and a meter reading, and men who had already done their work. She had an old tin and an old story. The matter, to almost everyone, was as good as closed, and in the borrowed room at night, Adeze came as low as she had ever been. Because it is one thing to be poor, and another thing entirely to have the well you built with years of sacrifice smashed to pieces, and to be called a thief for it, to have a clean name, the one treasure the poor can truly own, broken as easily as a tank is split. She sat with her tin held against her in the dark, and felt, for the first time, something close to despair. And then, because despair was a thing she could not afford with a child to raise, she opened the tin, unfolded the permit and the logbook, and looked at her borehole written out in dates and depths and a registered driller's hand, exactly as it had always been. For here is the thing Chief Mbakwe had forgotten, in his contempt, and the thing that would undo him. He had thrown away the word papers, as if a permit were nothing, because he was a man for whom an accusation and a bent record had always been enough, and the genuine truth had never once been required. It did not occur to him, as it does not occur to such men, that the poor woman whose well his men had smashed had done the one thing that could not be shouted down, drilled her borehole lawfully, under a licensed driller who logged and stamped it, and built it as a separate source that touched neither his estate nor the public main. The permit and the logbook in Adeze's hands did not care how confidently he lied. They showed the well as it truly was, a registered independent borehole, and the meter on the main. The meter he himself had pointed at, counted, drop by drop, water that came from his line and not from hers. And there was someone who knew how to make that meter speak. In the poorer quarter where Adeze had taken shelter, lived an older man her aunt knew, a retired water corporation engineer named Pa Solomon Adeyemi, a quiet, upright widower in his 60s, who had spent more than 30 years inside the Lagos Water Corporation, laying and metering and tracing the city's mains, and who knew the water network and its billing records the way a man knows the rooms of his own house. He had heard the talk of the woman they were calling a water thief, as the whole quarter had, and being the kind of man he was, he had also noticed her bearing. Too straight, too calm, too careful with her own child for the story to sit right with him. When her aunt mentioned that the accused woman swore she held a stamped drilling permit and a registered driller's logbook for her own borehole, something in the old engineer's professional soul woke up. A permitted borehole, a logged independent source. He asked, in his courteous way, whether he might see the papers, and Adeze, who had shown her tin to officials who would not read it, and a street that would not believe it, handed her permit and logbook at last to a man who had spent his whole working life knowing exactly what such records were worth. Pa Solomon sat down with the permit and the logbook under a good lamp, and he did the thing nobody in authority had been willing to do. Because they had not wanted the truth, only a quiet end to an inconvenient woman. He read them. Not glanced at them, read them, line by line, the way he had read 10,000 water records across 30 years, the permit number and the date, the registered driller's name and seal, the log depth and the water table the well had struck, the lease for the ground, the completion stamp. And the longer he read, the straighter he sat, because the documents were genuine and whole. A properly permitted, properly drilled, independent borehole, registered in her name. These were not the papers of a thief who had tapped a line. They were the papers of a woman who had sunk her own well. Complete in every part, the cold, clean certainty of it settled into the old engineer. The certainty he had felt 100 times across a service counter when a true record and a false claim are laid side by side, and only one can be read all the way down without falling apart. This woman was no thief. She had drilled her own borehole lawfully, and whatever the chief's meter showed, the missing water at that meter could not be hers, because her well never touched the main, and a hand-pumped borehole leaves its own plain signature that no tapped line can fake. The street had looked at a poor water seller and seen a thief. The truth was sitting in an old tin of papers no one had been willing to read. This was the turn. The moment a poor woman's ruin became a thing that could be undone. But Pa Solomon, who understood the network from the inside, knew that a genuine permit in a poor woman's hands proved her borehole was lawful, but did not by itself defeat the chief's accusation in the eyes of the corporation, for the chief had a complaint and a meter reading. And the fight would be decided, not by which paper looked more honest in a lamplit room, but by what the Lagos Water Corporation's own records actually showed, and by where the water actually went in the ground. So he asked the questions the dismissive officials never had. What did the estate's bulk meter and billing history truly show, month by month? And had anyone traced the pipes to see where the water behind that wall was really coming from? Because a water theft turns on the meter and the pipe, and a meter record is a thing that can be pulled and read, and a pipe is a thing that can be physically traced, and if the estate was drawing more than it paid for, the water was coming from somewhere. And a hidden, illegal connection to a man who had spent 30 years tracing mains leaves marks. And the marks were there, though the chief and his caretaker had been sure no one would ever look for them. The way the powerful are, always sure the small records will lie quiet beneath them. Pa Solomon still knew the corporation, and the honest people left in it and he did the simple, dogged thing his whole career had taught him. He pulled the estate's metered records and billing history and read them from the beginning. And the numbers told their own story. The estate's lawful bulk meter recording one modest, steady figure, and the actual draw on the main, month by month, swelling far beyond it, a great gap of unbilled water that had to be coming through a connection the meter never saw. The records did not point at a poor woman's hand pump on the corner. They pointed straight at the wall, at water vanishing into the estate that the estate's own meter never counted. The bulk meter and the billing history fit the truth like a key in a lock. The chief's accusation, laid beside them, fell apart. But Pa Solomon, who understood that records on a page can be argued over while water in a pipe cannot, would not stop at the meter. He brought in a licensed plumber, and together they did the one thing that would settle it past all denial. They traced the pipes themselves. They ran a harmless colored dye and a pressure test through a Daisy's borehole line, and showed it ran only to her tank and her pump, and nowhere near the main or the estate. And then they traced the estate's supply, and found, behind the high-painted wall, exactly what the missing water had promised would be there: a crude, illegal connection spliced into the public main, unmetered. Feeding the estate and the tankers Ifeanyi Eze had been filling and selling on the side. The dye ran where the truth ran. Adeze's water came up out of her own ground. The stolen water came out of the public main through a pipe hidden behind the chief's own wall. And when they traced who had cut it in and who collected for the tankers, the marks led, plain as the dye in the pipe, to the chief's trusted caretaker. So now there were the makings of a truth too solid to shout down. But there was the question of how it would be told. And Pa Solomon, who understood power as well as plumbing, made certain it would not be told in a way the chief could manage quietly. A private settlement, the illegal tap quietly capped, the caretaker shielded, the whole thing smoothed over, so that Adeze might one day creep back to a corner of broken ground carrying the shadow of water thief forever. He had seen that ending, and he would not have it here. The accusation had been made in the open, before the whole settlement, in the rain. The truth, he decided, would be read out just as openly, before a body that could not bury it. And the chance came, because the chief's own arrogance made it. So confident was Chief Mbakwe in his accusation and his meter reading, and so eager to put an official seal on the matter before any audit could turn the wrong way, that when Adeze, with Pa Solomon now quietly behind her, refused to vanish and began to press her case, the chief did not slink from a fight. He welcomed it. He demanded that the Lagos Water Corporation hold a public enforcement hearing to condemn her borehole as an illegal connection and close the matter once and for all, in the open with the authority of the law, so that no one could ever again say the missing water had anything to do with his estate. He came to have her well condemned before the corporation, and the public, it admitted. He did not know that the hearing he had called to crush Adeze was about to become the room in which his own caretaker's racket was opened, nor that Adeze herself, with the old engineer beside her, and her permit and the meter records, and the dye trace in hand, would be standing in that room to face the man who had smashed her borehole. The day came, and the corporation's enforcement panel sat in a plain public hall, the officers at the front, the chief's people grave and confident, the chief himself at ease, and a gallery of onlookers, neighbors, the curious, people who had heard the story of the water thief and the developer. The chief's side opened smoothly. Here was the complaint. Here was the bulk meter showing water gone. Here was a developer of standing whose supply a poor woman had been bleeding and now had the gall to dispute. And then there was a stir, and Adeze Okafor walked into the hall, not slinking, not begging, but upright in a clean plain wrapper, with her head wrapped neat, her flat tin in her hands, the old engineer Pa Solomon Adeyemi at her side. A murmur went up that the water thief had come, and the chief was almost amused. And it was then that Pa Solomon asked the panel, in the courteous, unhurried voice of a man who has metered and traced this city's water for 30 years and has all the proof he needs, whether the panel would permit a retired corporation engineer to lay before it the estate's own metered records, the woman's drilling permit, and the result of a physical pipe trace, because, he said, the water had a true path through the ground, and the meter had something to say that the complaint before them did not. The panel, bound to establish where the water actually went before condemning any connection, allowed it over the protests of the chief's people, and Pa Solomon began, plainly, patiently, number by number, and pipe by pipe. He opened a Daisy's drilling permit where the whole hall could see, and showed the registered driller's seal and the date, the permit number, the logged depth, the lease for the ground, a lawful, independent borehole. Then he laid out the Lagos Water Corporation's own certified records for the estate, the lawful bulk meter reading one modest figure, and the true draw on the main swelling far above it, month after month, a great unbilled gap that no hand pump on a corner could account for. And then he produced the trace, the dye and pressure test that showed a Daisy's line ran only to her own tank and never near the main, and the illegal connection found spliced into the public main behind the estate's own wall, feeding the unmetered water that the bulk figures had been missing all along. The borehole, he said, was hers, lawful and separate, and had stolen nothing. The missing water had been drawn through a hidden tap behind the chief's wall, and the records and the dye agreed, drop for drop. There was no water thief here on the corner. There was a woman whose lawful well had been smashed to cover a theft behind a rich man's gate. The hall, which had come to watch a poor woman condemned, went very still. Because the meter does not lie, and the dye does not lie, and the numbers and the colored water in the pipe said, plainly, what no poor woman's voice had been able to say in the rain. And then Pa Solomon, who had traced the connection to its source, named what the trace had found, that the illegal tap had been cut in and run, and the surplus water sold off by the tanker load, by the estate's own caretaker, Ifeanyi Eze. The missing water at the meter was his racket, hidden behind the wall, and the poor woman the chief had paraded as a thief had been chosen precisely because she sold water in plain sight and could be made to carry the blame. Chief Mbakwe, who had come to have a poor woman's well condemned, sat in a room turning against him and made the last mistake of a man who has never been contradicted. He tried to bluster over the meter and the dye, as he had blustered over a daise in the rain, declaring that he knew nothing of any connection, that his caretaker had acted alone, that he was himself the victim here. But it was too late for that in a room where the records had been read out, because a man who arrives in force to smash a poor woman's borehole, to bury a theft on his own property, cannot then stand back as if he had merely been robbed. The parade, the hammers, the haste to condemn her before any audit reached his gate, all of it now, read as exactly what it was. The panel had the meter, the permit, the dye trace, and the caretaker's racket laid out before them, and the story the chief had told the street in the rain lay in pieces on the floor of that hall. And then came the public accounting, the part this channel does not skip, because justice whispered in a back room is no justice for the poor. The Lagos Water Corporation's enforcement panel found, on the meter records, the permit, and the physical trace, that Adaize Okafor's borehole was a lawful, independent, properly permitted source that had stolen nothing, and that the missing water had been drawn through an illegal connection behind the chief's estate wall. The caretaker, Ifeanyi Eze, was arrested and handed to the police, charged with running the illegal connection, with the theft and unlawful sale of the public water, and with the malicious destruction of Adaize's pump and tank. The takings he had hidden from his tanker racket were traced and seized. And Chief Mbakwe, who had stood in the road and called a poor woman a thief before her own neighbors, was held publicly to account. The connection on his property condemned. His estate ordered to pay the full stolen water bill the meter had counted, and the chief ordered to pay full restitution for the borehole his men had smashed, out of his own pocket and his caretaker's seized money. The corporation referred the destruction and the false accusation onward, and the matter became, as he had so wanted it to be, a very public one. Only now it was his name, and not hers, that the city attached the word to. And the consequences did not stop at the hall. Word traveled the way word does, and the buyers who had been paying well for the chief's promise of clean, constant water in a properly run estate did not care to buy into a place whose water had been stolen from the public main, and whose owner had smashed a poor woman's well to hide it. His sales stalled, and then collapsed. The half-empty estate that was to crown his fortune became the thing his name was known for. The respectable big man who had measured everyone by their use to his standing watched his standing go the way of the water in a Daise's split tank, pouring away into the mud, and not to be gathered back. He had pointed at a poor woman to save himself, and the meter he pointed with had counted out his own ruin. For a Daise, the turn was not sudden riches, but something steadier and truer. The world forced, at last, to admit what she had carried all along. With the restitution ordered and her name cleared in the open, she rebuilt her borehole, and this time, better than before, a deeper, stronger well, a proper covered tank, a metered, registered supply that the whole settlement could trust, sunk again under permit, with every paper kept folded in the old tin. The neighbors who had filled their buckets there for years, and who had drawn back from her in the rain, came quietly back to the pump, some of them shamefaced, and she filled their containers as she always had, exact with her measure, exact with her change, because she was not a woman to make others kneel where she had knelt. She took the restitution money and did the one thing it was truly for. She lifted her child off that thin floor and into a real home, a proper roof, school fees paid without the old fear, water that never ran dry. The clean name she had nearly lost was hers again, and worth more now for having been tested in public and found true. And then, because the best of these stories do not end with one woman saved, but with the next one spared, a Daisy did the thing that turned her ruin into something larger than herself. She knew now, better than anyone, how easily a poor vendor with no papers could be branded a thief over water a rich man was quietly stealing himself, and she set about making sure the others around her could never be caught the same way. She helped the small water sellers of the settlement and the quarters beyond it do what she had done, and what her trouble had taught her to value: apply for their permits, use registered drillers, meter their supply, keep their logbooks, hold the paper that says the water is honestly theirs. She became, without ever seeking it, the woman the settlement's water sellers came to before they sank a well. The one who walked them to the right counter and made sure their work was lawful and recorded and safe from any big man's convenient lie. The well a powerful man had smashed to cover his own theft became the reason a whole settlement's water ran clean and lawful, and could not be stolen from the people who gave it. And on an evening months later, when the queues were gone, and the new pump stood quiet and strong on her own restored ground, a Daisy sat by a small lamp, with the old tin open on her knees, the permit and the logbook in her own careful hand, the small brass meter ticking faithfully on the main beyond her gate. No longer a poor woman's helpless keepsake, but the proof, kept and honored, that no rich man's lie thrown down from a height ever made the truth of her water untrue. Her child slept under a proper roof, with clean water a step away that would never run dry, and the settlement drank from a well that was hers, given honestly, and protected now by the very paper a great man had once thrown away with a word. The meter had counted, and the die had run, and the truth had been read out where the whole world could hear it, and the woman they had branded a thief in the rain was, in the end, the one the city had to thank for the water. That was tonight's tale from beneath the Baobab. If the truth in it moved you, come sit with us again. And tell me, before you go, when the powerful break what the poor have honestly built, should the law that finally vindicates them content itself with giving back what was smashed? Or should it make the big man pay until the whole city sees? Stay a while and tell me in the comments where you watched from.